Okay, so again, thank you again for joining me here today. And so we're going to take a look at these benchmarks and see what's new, see what's how they compare. All right. But before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge my gratefulness for being on this land. I am here on Treaty 6 here in Sherwood Park. That's where I'm coming from you today. And this time of year, I don't know, maybe you had some lovely sunflowers in your yard. I had one that a little bird planted for me, and it is like huge and massive. Like it's just got this big head. We had to support it. It's so heavy with seeds. It just, yeah. So I am so grateful for the gifts of this land, and grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today, and those who have gone before us. There's so much, so many things that we can learn from the land, from the people who have been here before us. So, and we recognize this land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those on whose territory we reside, work, and play. And I'd just like to bring attention to the calls to action. I have them hyperlinked in here, but for one of the things that I personally am working towards is the number 13, and that we call to Canada to respect the rights of the Aboriginal people, and this includes their right to have their languages respected. And I know this is about our English as an additional language students, but you know, when we think about the languages that are the people of this land who came with language, came with rich language, shared that language with us, and as we can continue to make sure that those languages stay alive. So not only for our English as additional language students, but also for our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So, so some of our guiding questions today are: how are the new benchmark EAL benchmarks similar to and different from the 2010 ESL benchmark version? And how can the EAL benchmarks be used for programming? So hopefully those are some of the reasons why you came here, and hopefully we can answer those questions. And you know, feel free to share your thoughts and ideas in the chat. Some ways you can share your thinking, if you want, is I think, or I noticed, or I wonder. Feel free to share any of your thoughts there in the chat. There will be a few opportunities. I'd also like to acknowledge the great work by Kathy Salmon and Jordan Foster. I based a lot of this presentation on a presentation that they did for the Calgary Regional Court Consortium on October 5th of 2022. And so I drew a lot of some of their examples and some of the outlines of what they shared in that presentation, and embedded that within this as well. So thanks to all their hard work and amazing, feedback that you have all provided to make these what they are today. You would have been in your email shared a survey, so I appreciate if you have some time to maybe open that up during this presentation, take a look and see and offer any feedback that you have in regards to this presentation and what that does for your professional learning, if you think it's beneficial for your professional learning. And you know, so because what I hear is you know, I need that for my personal and professional growth as well. So anything that you have to offer in terms of that would be great. Some of the outline of the session, these are kind of the touch points that we're going to go with, is kind of the why do we have benchmarks, and some of the shifts from benchmark 1.0 to 2.0, what the benchmarks, what they are now, and then any supporting competency indicators, what those are about, and the English language continuums, and the programming and some tools and routines. So EAL benchmarking, I see your question there, is is something that's necessary to do. We'll talk a little bit more about it as we go through the session. So I appreciate that question, and hopefully as we go through this, I'll get that addressed for you. So, and also, yeah, so we're going to look at some programming, some tools and routines as well. Great. So I have a task for you right now, and I'd just like you just to read this over. If you could complete that for me before we move on into the presentation. So I'll read it out for you. It's Lacuna, Dain Pagalan, and Pune and de Liotien. So if you could complete that for me, that would be great. I'll just take a sip of water here. Everybody have that task completed? Feel totally comfortable? Well, good. Awesome. Okay. Okay. So maybe you're feeling like my little Bitmoji expression right now. So like, what the what's going on? All right. Awesome. Okay. So why benchmark? That we're going to get into this a little bit. So hold on to that little activity. I'll be asking you to share your answers shortly. But why do we benchmark? So this is the front matter. If you have that, I'll share that again. The front matter of that, of the benchmarks here. I'm going to just put it back in the chat again for those who came a little bit later and may have missed that link. But so the benchmarks, this is the front matter. You'll see it on the first couple of pages there. But what I'd like to highlight is that, oh, and now it's not coming up. Teachers should be aware of the linguistic demands of the subject matter they teach, the vocabulary and language forms and functions students require to learn the Alberta curriculum. Okay, so back to that question, is it required, benchmarking required? If you want to understand the linguistic demands of your subject matter, the vocabulary and language forms and functions that students need to learn the Alberta curriculum, then yes, we should benchmark. So, and that, because we need to be aware of that, how we can provide that explicit language instruction and guided support that students need to listen, speak, read, and write for a variety of purposes and the formats associated. So what are the benchmarks used for? For assessment, so that we can look at their initial and ongoing language proficiency levels, that we can inform our instruction and programming, that we can set appropriate learning goals, that we can determine language learning supports, and that we can monitor and report language proficiency growth, and that we can communicate language proficiency levels to students and their parents and guardians. Okay, because we want to make sure that as a student is moving through the grades, that is their language improving. And we're going to take a look a little bit about the different types of language that we use in our day-to-day. Okay, so that's a little bit of that front matter. Please, in that PDF, take a look and read a little bit more of that front matter overview. Okay, so let's go back to that activity. So I did your benchmarks. I realized in order for you to complete this task, you need a little bit more explicit language support. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide some scaffolding for you and see if you can complete this task after. Okay, so Lacuna, Pangolin, und Pune and the liaison. Okay, so see, and I'm going to model this and model this activity, what I expect from you to do. So pay attention to the chat. All right. So I put something in the chat there. Please feel free to complete this activity now. See, how is my modeling? Let me know. Hopefully. Yay! All right. Woo, 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 woo. All right. Completed the task. Look at this. This is amazing. Like everybody's putting their name and their job in the chat. Awesome. Couple of visuals, a little bit of modeling, and you were able to understand what you were supposed to do with this language. Now, this language is like a conglomerate of many different languages. I can't remember where I pulled them all from. I don't know, I should have written it down where I got them from, but I think there's a little bit of Mandarin in there, a little bit of Bangla, maybe, I can't remember what I put in there, but there's a bit of everything in there for you. So awesome, you all completed the task, just that little bit. Okay, so the benchmark gave me some indications on that. All right, so as we go through, let's think about that. Okay, oops, went one too far. Okay, so the benchmarks are based on the idea of communicative competence. So because the end goal is what we want is for our students to be able to understand and use language effectively to communicate in a wide variety of contexts and for a wide variety of purposes, right? So we want them to be able to not only make friends on the playground or on the basketball court or wherever, and find their way from class to class to class and be able to ask their way. But we also want them to be able to, write that essay, complete that math task, do that lab assignment, whatever it may be. Okay, so if we break this down a little bit more, so into the linguistic and the discourse pieces. So some of you may be familiar with the old benchmarks, and that the benchmarks were based on linguistic, strategic, sociolinguistic, and discourse. So I'll give you a little teaser, a little foreshadowing, but the new benchmarks are kind of based on the linguistic pieces, which is the vocabulary and syntax, and the discourse to a degree. Okay, so if some of you are familiar with Jeff Tweers's work, Susan Dutro's work, they kind of talk about bricks, mortar, and buildings. So the bricks are they fall in that linguistic quadrant there. And that's the vocabulary that's specific to the content and the concepts taught in a discipline. So the vocabulary such as like globalization or photosynthesis or cumulus clouds or fables or whatever it may be. So those are the concepts that are taught in a discipline. The mortar words and phrases are those general utility vocabulary that students need to construct sentences and paragraphs so that they can have those discussions and use academic English. So we have our big bricks. And if you think about if we're building a wall, if we just set it up with bricks and didn't have that mortar to keep it together, that wall would fall over. So we need to think about how we create, bring it all together for our students. So that's why vocabulary and sentence structure are really at the forefront with the new benchmark. The other piece is the buildings, and that's kind of that discourse level piece. So, and that's how we connect all our ideas together. So how we transition from one sentence to the next, or how we transition from one paragraph to the next. And as you are probably familiar, that, when we're connecting all those words together, or those sentences and those paragraphs and ideas, there's certain connector words and transitions that we use depending on what type of language we're using. So if we're comparing and contrasting, we're going to use different connector words than we would if we're describing something, right? So just as a little heads up, I'll give you a little bit of a more in-depth of that as we go through this. But that's kind of, when we're thinking about the benchmarks, this is kind of where it's all based on. And, you know, back to that academic language that we want to communicate, and in a wide variety of contexts, wide variety of purposes, when we think about academic language and we think about how language changes from you know, science to history to math to ELA, then, you know, we use kind of different language through those different subject areas, right? So, and, you know, we just read, write, and think differently depending on which discipline we're working in. So that's why it's important for all teachers to, you know, take part in looking at the language that they're sharing in their discipline, and supporting our students as they're, you know, acquiring that language of their discipline. So it's not just on the ELA teacher to be responsible for all their benchmarking, because they have a framework of how they look at language, which is quite different than the framework of how math teachers or mathematicians look at their language. So we need to think about all of those, you know, that it's kind of a joint effort when we're thinking about benchmarking. And when we think about, you know, acquiring that language, we also want to think about the language environment that we're offering for our students. So Katie Arnett, in her book, Access for Success, I have it really tiny on the bottom there, she talks about the language environment being a physical and a cognitive space. So think about if you're traveling abroad and you don't speak the language of the place that you're visiting. What do you use from the environment to navigate your way around? Like, you're probably looking for signs, you're probably looking for gestures and things like that. So you know, you're trying to navigate. So you might be looking at the train station, the signs of where your next train is, where the platform is. You know, you may see the kiosks around you and know that you need to get food, things like that. So, and when you think about the physical space of our students that they're in to carry out their daily life, they're in our schools for 6-7 hours a day, right? So that's a huge part of their daily life. So what can we put in their natural environment to help them navigate and make sense of what they need to do with their language and make sense of the concepts that are being taught? So, you know, just like that previous example, just adding a couple of visuals and some modeling, then we can, you know, get students to enter into that physical space. And also, when you think about that instructed environment, you know, what's the kind of that tiny little grammar piece or a little sentence structure or something like that that will help students understand the language of your discipline or of that lesson of the day, that they can take part in the activity. So again, the benchmarks help highlight, you know, where a student may be at with their language, and then how you can move them forward with their language. And then the cognitive space is, what do we expect students to do with language? So as we looked at that, you know, academic language chart, science, math, ELA, social studies, you know, those languages are different, and how they interact with that language shapes how they come to and understand that and use that language. So we need to make it more explicit for our students as they're working through this. So we need to make the invisible visible. So it takes a bit of time to think about, okay, what language do I expect my students to be using? And what structures can I put in place to support that language development? And the benchmarks are, you know, a starting point to help you move through that. And the other piece that the benchmarks really highlight, and I'm getting to showing you what they actually look like, don't worry. But then is that they also take into account that progression that students use as they're accessing language and learning an additional language. So Jim Cummins, he talks about BICS and KELP, and maybe many of you in the room are familiar with this terminology, but BICS is kind of that basic interpersonal communication skills. And that's the language that we need to survive. So that's the language we need to find our way to the bathroom, make friends, or whatever it may be. Or go shopping, you know, so it's that language. It's often used in informal social situations. It's very context embedded. So there's lots of visuals. There's lots of nonverbal cues that you can make sense of what you're supposed to do, or the message that you're trying to get across. So, but then when there's also, and I should also add that, you know, usually this is language that's easier to acquire because we need it to survive. So usually within about a year or two, students become very fluent with this basic interpersonal communication skills. But on the flip side is the cognitive academic language proficiency. And this is what we need right from the get-go to support our students with. Not only if they're a beginner student, getting those basic interpersonal communication skills so that they can, you know, build community and feel a part of the school. But we need to be able to make sure that they understand and can access the content from right away. And as you are probably familiar, that academic language is very abstract. It's very context reduced. There's lots of cultural references. You know, you may have like metaphors and idioms and things like that, you know, students may like, what does that mean? Right? So we need to make that like basic and like that BICS language, and make it very apparent, not invisible, but make it visible. So, but because this language is necessary to understand and discuss the content of the classroom. So we need to make sure that we make that available for our students so that they can participate. I'm going to put a copy of the slide presentation in the chat, just using I'm a co-host here, so hopefully that works. And where's my chat? Or, oh, I haven't shared it with you, so where's my chat? Sorry about that. And all right, so that is in the chat, the presentation for you, so you should be able to access that. And you will get a copy of the presentation as well, in PDF format, and the recording of today's session as well. So thank you very much for your patience for letting me get to that. Okay, so the other piece about what the benchmarks take into account is the stages of second language acquisition. So if we're thinking about, you know, BICS and KELP as well, then, you know, our students, maybe they're just brand new to Canada, brand new to English, and they're kind of in what Krashen, I believe it is, calls the pre-production stage. So there's a lot of observing, lots of listening, lots of gesturing, and you'll kind of see that in the first 6 months or so of their initial exposure to, we'll say English in this case. And then they move to that early production. So there's simple comprehension and production as well. And that's kind of within the first 6 months to a year. And then they're working towards speech emergence. So they're expanding language proficiency. So 1 to 3 years. So they're really, you may think that they're quite fluent with the language. But then when we think about, are they using that academic language? So, and, maybe if that academic language was shared very explicitly, maybe they are using that as well. But usually within the 3 to 5 years, there's that functional academic language proficiency, and there's, starting to sound more and more like their grade-like peers. And then 5 to 7 years, they're kind of like in grade level language proficiency. So, you have your exemplar student, your model student. What kind of language would that student be using? And, after, when they're at kind of at that advanced fluency stage, then they would be using language like that. The benchmarks, now, if you're familiar with the 2010 version, like the version 1.0 that's out there right now, you may see that, kind of it's 5 stages. And, our benchmarks, they were in groups of 5 all the time. So you may kind of compare it to that. But as our benchmarks, they changed a little bit. So they kind of grouped it together so that we kind of have kind of a beginner stage. So we have kind of that pre-production, early production stage, kind of as a beginner of language learning. That intermediate stage where, in those, there's that speech emergence to intermediate fluency. So grouping them together as kind of an intermediate. And then there's advanced fluency. So, as they're just like our grade level, our model grade level peer, grade level student. And, we also see the staircasing. So, and as we compare, I have another slide here as we compare, but this is just right now, that staircasing model. And so we can see how it's that beginner, that intermediate, and advanced are kind of grouped together. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this so to help you make some sense of it, but that's just kind of the constructs of it right now. So let's take a look at the shift as we, as we compare that 1.0 to the 2.0 version. So the 2010 version that's out there right now to the new version that's out. Okay, so we're going to break it down into like the shift from ESL to EAL, about the divisions we're going to talk about, the levels, and the competencies. So the shift from that language from ESL to ELL to EAL, if we think about the benchmarks 1.0, they're called the English as a Second Language proficiency benchmarks. But, through lots of reflection, through lots of research, through lots of analysis, that ESL, it kind of assumes that there's only one other language and that English is the second language. So it doesn't really, it kind of, gets that hegemonic sort of idea that English is the be all and end all, but it's not really. Like, I mean, it's a great language, but there are 6,999 other languages in the world. So, so just thinking about that. English language learner is the majority of students in English medium schools who are continuing to learn English through the curriculum. And that ELL, it fails to distinguish English-only speakers from those acquiring English as an additional language. Because I'm an English language learner, I'm continually developing my vocabulary, I'm continually working on my sentence structure, I'm continually working on my discourse patterns. And so ELL is everyone who's already speaking English. We're all an English language learner. So that's why the shift to EAL, because it's a more strength-based because it not acknowledges that students, they may speak one or more other languages and is learning English as an additional language. So it's just kind of a shift in thinking. If you read a lot of literature from the United States, they do use the term EL, English learner, English language learner, but we're not in the States. We're in Alberta, and we're using EAL. So that's kind of the shift towards that as well. Yeah. So, and yeah, I'll just stop there because there's so much more to talk about there. Yeah, I won't start. We only have 2 hours. So just looking at the benchmarks here too, from that 1.0 to 2.0, you may recall, it's a little blurry here, but you may recall that in the existing benchmarks that we have right now, that it went up to 5 levels for each division. And then, so in kindergarten was 1 through 5, division 1 to 3, 1 through 5, division 2, 4 to 6, 1 through 5, and on as we go. But the thing that happened a little bit was, is that if a student, say, at the end of grade 6 was considered a level 4 proficiency level, when they were in grade 7, that compared to being a level 3 proficiency student. So there was kind of like, some of that inconsistency to try to make sense. So it was almost like a regression. And, communicating with parents and things like that, then it was, like, why did my student, they were a 4 before and now they're a 3, like, why is that working like that? So that's why there's a bit of a shift, so that there's consistent. So down through the grades, emerging literacy A, you're starting out, if you're in grade 10 or if you're in pre-K, you still kind of exhibit those same patterns of acquiring additional language at that early stage. And as you can see that, at the end of grade 1, for example, if you're a level 2, so say you're advanced at the end of grade 1, the language, you're still, and when you go into grade 2, you're still a level 2, but you're not advanced anymore, because that language becomes a little bit more, we're moving up the academic range. So there's a little bit more rigor in the language that's required for that to be like that grade level peer. So you're an intermediate. And then, you're maybe by the end of grade 3, that student will be at a 3, at level 3. And then when they're in grade 4, they're still a level 3. But because of the rigors of the curriculum and the language required, that in grade 4, you're an intermediate student. So that's a little bit of the shift. Good question about if I can clarify how these benchmarks compare to the Canadian language benchmarks. Great question. I need a whole different session for that. They were kind of based, the Canadian language benchmarks are based more for an adult context, and also that, yeah, there's similarities for sure, especially at this emerging literacy kind of stage. Canadian benchmarks, there's 12 levels, I believe, plus there's also for emerging literacy, I think there's extra benchmarks on the gaining entry into literacy. So there's yeah, I could probably talk with a bit more preparation and research. I could talk a little bit more about it. I did teach adults and use the Canadian language benchmarks, but there is some different nuances and things that they're looking for in the Canadian language benchmarks versus what the competency indicators that we're looking for here in these benchmarks. And we're going to talk about your question here, when 2.0 is in place, will we be required to report the numerical level as well as beginner, intermediate, or advanced? Hold on to your seats. We'll get there. Don't worry. That's a great question. I'm glad I anticipated it. So just a little bit about that shift from ELP as a beginner and ELP5 as advanced is now advanced, and it changes with developmental growth. So you can see that pink area as we move through the grade levels, it changes with developmental growth. And beginner and intermediate 1 took longer in 7 to 9 and 10 to 12 as the gap is bigger, right? So more language is needed to be intermediate or advanced. And also just kind of some of the comparisons, some of that overlap is that the divisions indicate developmental changes in expectations with language, and the advanced staircases with each division. So just, there's still that staircase event aspect to it. And the intermediate 3 in benchmark 2.0 is similar to the English language proficiency 3 in benchmark 1.0. And, that's kind of where most students will be kind of at grade level. But, we still want some more of that rigor in that language. And then just that additional supports are required to support EALs to move from beginner to intermediate and intermediate to advanced. So we still need supports. Those supports just may look different from moving from beginner to intermediate and intermediate to advanced. Okay, so these are we'll just do kind of a little activity here and take a look. You can type your responses in the chat. So if we take a look at the ELP, or our English language proficiency, so what English language proficiency is an intermediate in pre-kindergarten? And there can be more than one answer. So just feel free to type in the chat. Awesome. Yeah. So great. Got it. Yeah. So pre-K, an intermediate would be a B or a 1. What ELP, English language proficiency, is a beginner in grades 4 to 12. So if we look at our grades 4 all the way to 12, what would be a beginner? And again, can be more than one answer. Great. Great. Yeah. So if we're in a grade 4 to 12, they're going to be starting at A to be a beginner, all the blue, and then all the way to 12, they would be a 2. So from A to 2 would be considered beginner. So for grade 1, what level would be advanced for grade 1? 2. Awesome. Great. And for EL, what level? So is it beginner, intermediate, or advanced? Is that level 3 for grades 2 to 3? Great. Yeah. So if we see our grades 2 to 3 and ELP3 is in that pink level. So they are advanced. Awesome. And what ELP is a beginner for grades 10 to 12? Again, A to 2. Awesome. Great. So it's just a little bit about, thinking about beginner, intermediate, and that ranges of language proficiency that fall within each of those ranges. So just a little bit looking at the competencies and comparing those. In the benchmarks, there were 7 competencies that we needed to look at for listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And for the benchmarks, we're only looking at 3. And I'll share with you in just a minute what those 3 are. I kind of gave it away when we were talking about communicative competence. Think about bricks, mortar, discourse. So we're thinking about 3. So we're not addressing everything when we're looking at those key competencies of our language learners. And so if we look at this again, this is on, if you have that, I'm just going to share the link to the PDF just in case you missed it. And it is on the last page. This is kind of highlighted in here. And it's going to take me a minute. There we go. I'll just copy that link and put that back in the chat. And so this is on the last page, the appendix page of the benchmarks. And just so you can see those shifts. So before we were looking at unique indicators for each competency. We were looking at linguistic vocabulary. We were looking at linguistic syntax, grammar, those sociolinguistic aspects, strategic in speaking and writing. In listening, we were looking for clarification and questioning. Reading, we were looking for decoding and comprehension, and discourse in that listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And but now what we're looking at is just the 3. We're looking at vocabulary in listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and a bit of a refresh to it. We're looking at sentence structure, and we're looking at connections and transitions. And then we can also use those supporting competencies to address any other areas. So if we look at, vocabulary, sentence structure, connections, and transitions, and we see that students maybe aren't moving forward like we expect them to, we can use those supporting competencies to give us some extra information and to give us some extra look-fors. So, yeah, so these are all the things that have, been added, refreshed as well. So feel free to take a look at that last page on of that PDF. And it's the appendix page, and that's where I got this screenshot from. There we go. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. Awesome. Here we go. So this is what, I should have had a drum roll before I changed the slide. So this is what the benchmarks look like now. I don't know if you remember, or if you've used the 1.0 before. Maybe you're new to this whole realm, which is fine. But before, you would have gotten like a 28-page document of the benchmarks and looked at it and said, wait, what? What am I supposed to do with this? But now, the key competencies that we want to look at are on one page. So if you look at the vocabulary, we're looking at understanding and use. For all of these, it says understands and uses, understands and uses. So, and there are some little change here in this emerging A literacy, understand the word and to connect ideas and connects 2 and 3 words. So, but that understands and uses talks about the receptive language that students are using, which is listening and reading. And the uses addresses that productive language that students are using. So speaking and writing. So we can kind of look at the whole range of their linguistic, what they're using in their language, and just look at one page instead of flipping through. And again, one thing that's there's a bunch of things in here, and I'm pretty excited. I don't know if you can tell, but that there is no more counting words. So You know, I don't know if you remember on the linguistic page here, linguistic vocabulary, if you look at benchmarks 1.0, under listening, speaking, reading, and writing, it said, you know, at a level 1, understands 5,000 words. And teachers would go, what? How do I know if they understand that many words? But now we're not using that kind of language anymore. The other piece on this document is that it's a lot more teacher-friendly vocabulary. Although I am a little sad that that word circumlocution is no longer in here. That was, once I figured out what that word was, I thought that is the greatest word. So circumlocution is talking your way around a point. So if you don't know the word for refrigerator, you'll talk your way and say, it's that thing in my kitchen. It keeps the food cold. And yeah, so that's circumlocution, kind of talking your way around. But I thought that was a great word. Anyway, so this is the one-page, all-in-one, one-stop shop for your benchmarking for referring to. I mean, obviously, you're going to use supporting materials. So you're going to use little assessment measures to compare the benchmarks to. And go from there. But this is your one-stop shop. Okay, so we're going to be breaking it down a little bit more as we go through, but we'll just move on from there. So vocabulary. We're going to take a look at vocabulary. This, as you know, is from A to 6. And if we're thinking about our students A through 6, this would be like our high school students. And as you remember, this staircasing, you know, in pre-KK, we'd only be looking at A, B, and 1. In grade 1, we would be looking at A, B, 1, and 2. And so thinking about the grade that you're in, you wouldn't look at the whole range up to 6. You would only look at that staircase that pertains to your grade level. So if we look at, you know, just our survival words, thinking again about basic interpersonal communication skills, hello, goodbye, water, food, toilet, mom, dad, that would kind of fall in our emerging A, or emerging literacy A language proficiency. So using survival words, basic utility words. Familiar words like book, car, house, socks. We're moving up a little bit. As you can see, familiar words are in emerging B as we go through. Words of personal importance. So like soccer or kirpan or hijab. Again, between about level B as well. Instructional words such as write, say, talk, copy, go, take out, put. Those are starting to get into our level 1, right? So that they can start following simple instructions. Social phrases such as, how are you? Do you want to play? Would also be under level 1. Synonyms, big, large, sad, cry, small, tiny, would fall under our level 2 because we're starting to see synonyms and antonyms there. And antonyms, big, small, open, close, and slow, fast would also be under level 2. Oops. And sorry about that. And I'll just go back one. Descriptive words, again, level 2, depending, red, round, flat, heavy, bumpy. So we have descriptive words, you know, there's more high frequency and a few low frequency words. But red, round, flat, heavy, bumpy could be, depending, they may be level 2 or level 3, depending. Because heavy and bumpy, that may be more into the level 3, depending on the grade that they're at. There's more subject-specific words as we move into grade level 3. Words with multiple meanings are also in level 3. Interdisciplinary words label, define, compare, summarize. We start to see, multiple meanings as well, academic words. So a level 4 would be label, define, compare, summarize. Technical words, such as supply, demand, numerator, denominator, causal, assertion, would also be under, depending, are they understanding and using their more low frequency words, but we also have a range of words. So are they using these words in all of their disciplines, or are they just using numerator and denominator in math? So that's why, again, it's important to have that collaboration amongst all subject teachers, so that you can have that conversation, that that you notice that your student in social studies isn't using words like supply and demand, but in mathematics they are using words like numerator and denominator, or or causal and compound. Maybe they're not using some of those words. So before you start saying, okay, I think they're at a level 4 or 5, have that discussion amongst all disciplinary teachers, that you can actually kind of identify that a little bit. And root words. Oops, sorry about that. Root words. So understanding some of those technical words, figurative language as well. So I know that technical words here is under a level 6, but again, thinking about that broad range, and that's why I bring it up, broad range of words, because, we need to have that discussion. So yeah, they're using numerator and denominator, but they're not using supply and demand. So do they have a broad range if they're not using those in all of their disciplines? That's a discussion. So, and thinking about those root words, and root words, having that knowledge about the affixes and suffixes can really help with those academic language. So let's just do a quick little check-in. And again, we're going to kind of take a look for our grade 10 to 12 students. And so what level do you think the following words would be at? Now, I realize they're sentences, but if we're thinking about the vocabulary that a student is using, would they be an A, B, 1, 2, 3 on the way to 6? So the first one, so just put them in the order in the chat that you think that they may be. So my plan is to use social media, and I hope that one of my songs goes viral. Then maybe I will get a following and be really popular. So do you think that's 1, 2, 3, whatever it may be? In my community, there is a baker, mail carrier. So something that they would need to fill in the blank for. If I pass the bar and become a lawyer, I would like to open my own practice in private law. It would be interesting to get involved with contracts and dispute resolution. And there are specializations with lighting and sound, cinematography, and with set decoration or construction or costume design. And chefs make food in busy restaurants. They order ingredients and prepare food. They work with other chefs to make food quickly. So I'll give you a minute and type what you think those levels may be in the chat. A4. Thanks. All right. How y'all doing? 616. Awesome. Okay, so let's see. Thank you for those who put those in there. Keep them coming. Great. So we'll see if we're kind of on the same page here. So I kind of put in my community, there is a Baker Merrier mail carrier as a level 1. They have some basic descriptive words. So, and then could also be a B. You know, again, as we think about that range, beginner, intermediate, advanced, you know, maybe there are some nuances in there. Chefs make food in busy restaurants. If you look at the language, pardon me, they're using some more high frequency words. There's a few low frequency words like prepare or chefs, and moving from there. If you're thinking about that, my plan to use social media, my songs go viral, we've got language proficiency of 3. And then there's a specializations with lighting and sound, cinematography, set decoration, construction, costume design would be in a level 5, just because they're very, obviously there's some technical words in there, like cinematography, lighting and sound, but there are more, you know, just focused on that level 5, because they're more subject specific in terms of that area. And then if I pass the bar, open my practice, then get involved, contracts, dispute resolution, put them at a 6. So thank you very much for everybody for participating in that. We wrap our head around that. Okay, let's look at sentence structure. And again, if we're looking at a level A, we've got 2 to 3 memorized phrases, fragmented phrases. We're moving into pattern sentences, moving up into level 1 as well. We've got declarative, imperative, interrogative sentences as we're moving up through into level 2. We've got some compound sentences, again, level 3. Compound and complex sentences and simple paragraphs. And those would be kind of moving into level 4. Level 3 for that previous one. And then once we're connecting them, we're moving into level 4. Variety of sentence types, in structured oral paragraphs, sequence paragraphs. We're moving into level 5. And then we have a range of sentence structures in cohesive paragraphs. And a broad range and level 6. And compound and complex sentences attending to syntactical features that impact meaning, that would also be in level 6. And we've got varied and sophisticated sentence structures. Okay, so as we move up through those ranges, through sentence structure, we can kind of see how we start from those early phases, memorized phrases, fragmented phrases, 2 to 3 words, sorry, that's like a level A, and then they're working their way towards varied, sophisticated sentence structures, and have some subtle shift in meaning. So if we take a look at these sentences and see how we would place them for a grade 10 to 12 student on the benchmarks, the first sentence, many aspects are included in a lab report, including a title, problem statement, hypothesis, materials, procedures, results, analysis, and conclusion. A scientist may consider a hypothesis before they conduct an experiment and after they complete the experiment. and they determine if the data can be used as evidence. So where would you place them on the benchmarks? We are going to do an investigation. What do you wonder about? What are your questions? Guess what will happen when we try different things? Where would that be on the benchmarks? The third sentence is, now let's have a look at the data that we gathered. You recorded observations from each of the different materials and you made notes when you use different materials. Look at this data and compare the materials to each other. So again, this is more from a teacher talk. So what's the student understanding for that? Which one is red? Which one is bigger? Is this red or blue? Again, that would be more from a teacher, what's the language the teacher would be using so that the student could understand it. In controlled experiments, attention needs to be given to the variables. The manipulated variable is the one the experimenter changes as part of the experiment, which affects the responding variables that change as a result of the experiment. All of the other variables should remain the same. So where would you place them? Thanks, we've got some responses coming. Awesome. Great. Awesome, great. Thank you very much. So let's see. We've got some coming in. So which one is red? Which one is bigger? Is this red or blue? So we've got some fragmented phrases. We've got, it could be emerging literacy B, or it could be 1, because there's simple pattern sentences. So it could be either B or 1. We're going to do an investigation, blah, blah, blah. You know, these are very command sentences and sentence structures. We've got some question words or question sentences in there. So we've got some, they're familiar simple sentences. So maybe that's an LP2. The third one, let's have a look at the data that we gathered. You know, so we're starting to move into some simple and familiar compound sentence types. And we're going to jump over to language proficiency 5, because we've got some compound and we've got a variety of compound and complex sentences. And I'm trying to put those into a cohesive paragraph. And then the last one, LP6. So we've got compound, complex sentences. There's variety of sentence lengths, varying audiences that we may address this for. And it's very extended oral written text. Okay, so thank you everybody for that. Awesome. Yeah, and then connections and transitions. Again, you can see the range, especially, you know, this is the entire range that you would be looking at if you were teaching grade 10 to 12. Again, if you're just in the pre-K, K, you would be looking just at the A through 1. And as you move through grades, the staircases that you would look through. So, you know, that we have the function. Why do we have the connections and transitions? So in the emerging literacy, that they can understand and use and connect the ideas with and that they can link and connect ideas as we move up into emerging literacy B. And yeah, so they're connecting. They got a few more high frequency words and connecting ideas. So organizing, locating, time markers, sequence markers. Then they're starting to move into level 1. Explain and detail and express a condition. Here we're starting into level 2. Emphasize, compare, contrast, show cause and effect. Moving up into level 3. Express an opinion into level 4. Introduce examples and explanations. We're moving up into level 5. Rephrase, qualify, clarify, transition, show exception, results, consequences, change of condition. These would kind of fall under level 5 as well. Conclude, suggest a possibility, also be in level 5. Oops. And yeah, so, but what I'd also like to point out too with the benchmarks is that, okay, so you have a student who, whether it be in emerging literacy A or maybe they're in emerging literacy 2, but what you can see is, or sorry, I said emerging literacy, I meant level 2. But if they're in any of these levels, that you can see where the student needs to progress to achieve the next level. So you can start thinking, okay, so what kind of structures are they working in on this level? Level A, B, whatever. They're using lots of connections to 2 to 3 words. But what can I do to help them to move towards that level B, right? So maybe I can introduce some a few more high frequency words to connect their ideas. Or maybe the task at hand is that they have to organize and locate. So maybe I should be introducing a couple of simple key words that give them time markers or sequence markers. So just because they are at that level A or B, it doesn't mean that you can't stretch, right? Because if you're familiar with comprehensible input +1, we want to just stretch them just a little bit more so that it's still understandable, but they can, work towards another level. So I'll just add, like I've been trying to learn French, and so I took a beginner level French class, and the first day was the instructor gives kind of the framework of how the lessons are going to go on a weekly basis. And she said, well, I'm going to ask you at the end of each class what you have planned for the weekend. And then when you come back next week, I'm going to ask you what you did on the past weekend. And I'm like, I don't even know how to say like my present tense, like what I'm doing right now. But if she had some, scaffolds in place where I could say, okay, over the weekend, I'm going to like do laundry, like give me a couple of words that I could pull from, then I could be able to share what I'm going to be doing in the future, or I could be able to share what I did in the past, providing I have those scaffolds in place, right? So it's comprehensible. But all I could say was, je m'appelle Stephanie. That's all I got, because I don't have the language to share that. But as we saw from that first activity, you were able to complete that task because I provided visuals, I provided a model for you in place. And that came to light when I was taking another class. I thought, oh, I got je m'appelle Stephanie down, no problem. I'll take this workshop on improving your French language. And I thought, I'm going to take a chance. It's 2 days, intensive workshop. And all the people who signed up had taken French through their whole high school career. Some of them had university degrees. And I'm like, whoa, this is too much. But by the end of those 2 days, because she was using, and I'm going to share some of these strategies with you, sentence frames, visuals, able to speak in my home language to clarify information, and that I was allowed to do that. I was justifying movies. I was making book recommendations. I was sharing about my family. And, so she wasn't limiting me to my emerging literacy because that's where I am in French. But she was using those scaffolds that allowed me to share what's important to me, right? So just wanted to put that out there. So don't let yourself be limited to what you see the student doing in these. This is a benchmark and it's a starting point for you so that you can also, say, okay, but the task at hand is this. What do I need to do so that I can provide those scaffolds for those students so that they can still access the content? I hope that makes sense. And oh, there's a question. Can a student demonstrate understanding language at one level and use language at a lower level? Actually, that's something that, sometimes we tend to see is that students, they've been observing and taking it in. And yes, they may understand more than what they're able to produce, right? Because, I could probably read something and pull some of those words that I may understand out of it, but I may not have those sentence structures down pat in place so that I can actually share my thinking. So yes, usually that receptive is usually that, like, they're listening and they're reading can be at a higher level than their productive language. So yeah, so that was my rant. And so just to look at some of the connections and transitions, that continuum as well. So it's broken down on those different discourse patterns that we use, like connecting, adding, showing time, sequencing, cause and effect, things like that. And also emphasizing, suggesting possibilities. So if we look at those transition words and those connections, we can see that at the beginning levels, there's not that many. But what can we do to share this vocabulary with our students so that they can start building and growing that language? All right. So those are a few examples. Also embedded in this document as well is a tool for you to monitor that progress over time. As one person in my CLC, my collaborative learning community, pointed out, students aren't just data, students are a story. And I love this sheet because it helps you find out more about the student's story. And so from initial intake, you can look at their proficiency levels in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And as the question was earlier, we report the numbers versus, beginner, intermediate, and advanced. When we use beginner, intermediate, and advanced, we can kind of group that student. So like they're a beginner, they're a student that's beginning to, add English to the languages they know. And, so what do we need to consider? And then intermediate, they're an intermediate student. They're building on their languages, things like that. Yeah, go ahead. Your question.
So, okay, so I'm just trying to get a handle on because we're trying to figure out what we're going to actually use instead of like you said, the 19-page thing that's ridiculous. So if we were to use this in our school, and I was starting at year 1 with the new program, I'd be writing down, say, my name, my students are grade 3, and then so the beginner, intermediate, advanced never goes on there. It's just like the AB. Yeah, you would just write. Okay. So it's because this little chart is up in the corner, I don't have to put that down.
That's right. Then you can
and then the intake proficiency levels. So if I have their, I'm getting a little bit confused, sorry. If I have their levels from last year,
okay,
how do I then okay, so they got tested at the end of last year, then how do I make that into this new intake level for this year?
I do understand that. I would keep that information. And then maybe on your intake notes, maybe say, according to benchmarks 1.0, they were at level 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe you can attach that. And then, you know, so obviously they're probably in year 2 now, maybe of funding. So you would start your documentation under year 2. So if you assess them in year 1 for your, you know, using the old benchmarks, then you wouldn't fill in that column. You would start at year 2 using the new benchmarks if that's what you decide.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. And then I know that there's like some examples in this document. Is there like a testing document that you can be like, oh, I'm going to print this page, I'm going to print this page, I'm going to do this activity, or are we still just pulling from all over the farm like we have been in the past?
Yeah, there is no, like, it depends on what your division decides to do. There's I'm going to share a tool with you at the end of this presentation where you can go, but a lot of pulling over the farm, depending like the story that you want to create for your students. So yeah, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There's nothing standardized for these yet. So yeah. Awesome. Thanks for your question. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm just wondering, when I look at the documentation, you just mentioned maybe they're in year 2 of funding. So is the 5-year timeframe for funding still in place with benchmarks 2.0?
Yeah, it's all according to the funding manual. This is just another, you know, this is just a tool that's used for benchmarking. Yeah, it doesn't allow for the student to start at year 0 again, but you know, it's just still the 5 years of funding that they get.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even I ask, there's a note on the tracking form part B at the bottom that says students who require and receive additional years of EAL support should remain coded and their language proficiency continue to be assessed. Right. So I'm assuming they would stay coded but not receive funding.
That's totally correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So yeah. And thanks for bringing up part B of that, because this is on as well in the document so that you can, you know, have a PDF version. You know, that's something that you can record when the student has achieved that level of proficiency. So if you're looking at a student in level A, maybe by, I don't know, maybe by the end of the year or May or whatever, they've achieved all of these indicators. So, but right now, throughout the year, they're operating as an emerging level A. So, and then, yeah, so we're thinking about achievement. So when we're thinking about the benchmarks, it's an area that they're working in. And then when they've achieved that, then move up to their emerging literacy B. But you can see that maybe in their listening, they've achieved that, but in their speaking, they haven't. So you wouldn't fill that in. Or, but then if they've achieved that for their listening, that you could move up into their listening for emerging level B, right? And then they've achieved that. Yes, question, please.
So then is the expectation, just to go kind of hopping off the last lady's comment, is the expectation then now that we benchmark all EAL learners until they reach level 6, irregardless of their grade?
You would, that's a good question. So when you feel that the student has reached in those 5 years, that they've reached the language proficiency of their grade level peers, that you would benchmark them. So, and as you can see, yeah, like because of the question, because of the staircasing, you know, maybe they don't, you know, they're in a level 2 at the end of grade 1, but then grade 2, 3, that they're still, you know, intermediate. And I can see where your question's coming from. Would you keep them on a benchmark until they're in grade 12? I don't think that would be necessary, because if they're over time, like I would keep it for a year or two and see that they're consistently using the language of their grade level peers. And if they're doing that for a year or two and they're still within their funding, then you can remove the code. I don't know if that really helps you answer the question, but I would
I guess
also,
I'm just wondering about, like, say at my high school, we have students who we know when they get to be in grade 8, 9, 10, and they've funded out and they're no longer like progressing, or they've kind of become stagnant. They're no longer accessing their accommodations for exams. So we just kind of stop benchmarking them.
funding.
So if we get audited, are we going to be scolded because we do not have paperwork for these students?
Well, you should still be trying to see what kind of supports you can do for students who are no longer being funded, but still need support in academic language growth, right? So, you know, so it's still good to track their language use and to discuss how you can support those students. Awesome. I don't know if that, and I would, I have a slide here at the end of, you know, through Alberta Education, people that are much more in the know than I am. So, yeah, that's just my general interpretation. I don't know if that helps. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at this document that you said, and it has at the top date achieved.
Mhm.
Is this an editable PDF, or where do you write the date? Like, I'm just looking at thinking this doesn't
Right.
actually make sense to me, or you just
Right.
scribble it in there somewhere.
Well, right now it's just a PDF. That's all.
Okay.
You know, school divisions, you may have school divisions, depending on your school division. Some school divisions are adapting this to work within Power School or whatever they use, or, you know, or converting it to an editable PDF.
Okay,
So,
okay, that makes
yeah.
sense. Okay,
Yeah.
I thought I was just missing something. Okay, thank you.
No, sorry, thanks. Okay. Awesome. And great. And Lisa?
Sorry, I have to unmute. Okay, sorry for this question. I'm at a private school, and we are kind of we don't get any funding. And so students who come in with admissions are supposed to be at a level 5 as assessed by the CBE, but that's not actually the case. So my question is, like, we haven't been benchmarking. So, because we haven't really had EAL learners, but we do now.
Right.
So is this an Alberta Ed requirement that we do this, or is this funding related?
Well,
it's good for teaching and learning. I just want to know whether legally we're supposed to be documenting this.
If you are not getting funding, that's a tricky one. I don't want to step out of my bounds there. So I will refer you to Alberta Education. If you have the link already, it's at the end of the slide. So
thank you.
But yeah, because I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah,
I know it's step out of my bounds.
No.
And
thank you.
Great, thanks. And Natalie, did you have another question, or are you good for now? I'm sorry. Okay, thanks. All right, so let's move on. We've got about half an hour left, and we've got some road to cover still. So let's take a look here. So this is just something, the monitoring the benchmarks over time, so a tracking sheet. And also they created a document, like a one-pager, a little bit more parent-friendly language, so that you can report to parents. This is also included within the document. So, you know, right now it's only in English. You know, if you have access in your school divisions to offer, you know, to get this translated in the various languages that you use in your school, that could be a possibility. But they tried to make the language a little bit more friendly so parents can understand where their child's language is and how it's progressing. So we have their benchmarks. We've found their proficiency indicators. And so what can we use the benchmark for? So we can use it to, like that front matter says, inform that task design and instruction, identify what type or level of language the curricular content is at, and then support identifying language intentions to go with the learning intentions. And we can use the supporting competencies as well to help monitor the language growth over time and inform programming and supports. So there is a document in here as well to see kind of where our students may be working through, what kind of supports you can put in place. If you have an emerging A or B literacy student, some intensive literacy, numeracy development with them, and depending on their grade level. So as kind of color-coded as well, of what kind of supports you can offer them depending on their grade level and depending on their language proficiency level. So it's a little bit there for you. And also just looking at those supporting competencies, they're still, like from 1.0, they're still there. There's lots of, a little bit of refreshment of those pieces. And also there are a few new features as well. So we're still looking to consider those sociolinguistic perspectives and those strategic pieces, because these are all pieces that, are great learning strategies and what they're doing with the language. So, and also a few pieces to consider too with, instructional strategies, learning supports, strategic communication for oral text comprehension and participation in an interaction, and looking at grammar as well. So there's also continuums that are available. So there is the sentence and structure continuum, and these can help you support your assessment so that while you're looking at the sentences that students are using, how do they compare on this continuum? So it can help you target some of those information. Yes, there are, you'll see there's examples that are embedded for listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The continuums also add that extra piece of information to help with those assessment pieces, teacher understanding, and also helping parent-student understanding of where they're at. So quickly like to, just introduce a couple of ideas through tools and routines that you can use in your practice, or that you may want to support teachers with, in terms of, okay, they've benchmarked. Now, what do I do? Thinking about that comprehensible input +1, and how we can, kind of stretch that language just a little bit and support students with that. So, but before we go into that, I'd just like to remind you that this quote from Shelley Fairbairn and Stephanie Jones-Bowe, that they say that our EAL students, they don't have the luxury of waiting until they're fluent in English to engage in essential learning of content material. So from the very first day, each EAL student is playing catch up with native English speakers, having to backfill vocabulary along with content further complicated by cultural factors. So what kind of instruments can we put in place to support our students right from day one? Okay, and just considering the ideal conditions for language learning, that they need to be exposed to vast quantities of language. They need opportunities to interact with their more proficient language users. There shouldn't be expectations to understand or produce language that is too far beyond their current stage of language development. So if you're asking them to share what they're doing on the weekend, what scaffolds are you going to put in place so that, it's in their stage of language development and that they can actually produce an answer. So that we have the simplified language, depending on their proficiency level. We've got shorter sentences, slower rate of speech, repetition of words and phrases. This is especially true for our beginner proficiency students. And having that language linked to context. So what visuals can we put in place? We don't point out their language errors or criticize them. We don't correct their speech errors, but we model what those correct utterances may look like, and that we expand on their responses. So if they're just giving us yes and no, what can we do to expand those responses? Can we give them sentence frames? Can we ask them more questions? Can we, add visuals to it? And then remember that language is learned through purposeful use. So is the language that's being worked, that they're being introduced to, is it meaningful to them? Is it related to the content, right? So again, back to me, learning French and thinking about the textbook examples that we went through chapter 1 on day 1, chapter 2 on day 2, and it was all about mon chat and all that kind of stuff. But I don't have a dog or a cat. What do I care about comparing about a dog and a cat? I want to be able to, share about my experiences and what I'm doing and things like that in French. So thinking about what's meaningful for our students, how can we connect to that? So that's a little bit from Coelho on her book, Adding English. And then, thinking about comprehensible input, thinking about those ways to have multiple representations. How can we break down that language heavy content? When we're speaking, are we using appropriate verbal input? Do we have a slower rate of tone? Are we using nonverbal cues? And when we're explaining, are we, giving a clear explanation of the tasks at hand? Are we giving step-by-step instructions, that modeling? And also using peers as a support. Their classroom is a huge resource for you. I know there's 30, 40 of you in the classroom, but we can use all of our students to help and guide our students who are adding English. And so either through Google Translate, L1 Peers, or through collaboration. And like your question earlier, comprehension comes before production. So you're usually going to see that they're understanding what they need to do for the task, but before they actually come to production, then they need some scaffolds in place. And just to address some of those links between language learning and attention, I put Oscar here because I had Grover at school. So, so learners that they may be unable to sustain their focus when experiencing an overload. So if we're thinking past, we want comprehensible input +1. If we're doing comprehensible input +5, they're going to be in an overload. So you may notice some behaviors such as shutting down, off task, fidgeting, not seeming to know what they're doing. They're avoiding tasks. They want out of their seat. They're overwhelmed. They need monitoring. They're sidetracked. They're daydreaming or have a blank stare. They're frustrated. They're bogged down. They need lots of breaks. They need more time to complete a task. And they're having difficulty to follow the pace of the lesson. And if they're offering irrelevant answers or information. So if they're bogged down and overload in the linguistic demands of the learning experience, they're not going to be learning the content or the language. So we need to think of what we can do to measures we can put into place. And the benchmarks are great for getting us to reflect on that and seeing where our learners are at, what's the next step that we can do to support them. And that's all tied to the affective filter, which is some of Krashen's work, and building up that invisible wall. And when you're thinking about that invisible wall, it's part of what Zaretta Hammond in her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, she talks about the limbic brain, which is our emotional brain, and where we're constantly, where everyone, our learners and us as well, that we're constantly scanning our environment for threats or rewards. And the amygdala is going to send out hormones to, if we're feeling threatened, it's going to send out those adrenaline hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. And that affects, if that's constantly coursing through our system, it's going to affect our working memory. And our working memory is that short-term memory, which has a significant role to play on language development, long-term memory. So, when our working memories, where cognitively our brain interprets that new information, makes connections between new information and previous knowledge. So it's important that they're not having all those stresses through, so that they can make sense of the content and the language that's in the lesson. So you want to plan for the language demands. You want to think about what are going to be the language demands of my unit and of my lesson. So thinking about that, we need to, again, address that language environment, thinking about that physical and cognitive space, and what the interaction demands are going to be. What are some mini lessons I can provide for my students? What kind of visuals can I put up in my class, anchor charts, whatever it may be, so that they can refer to what they need for the lesson and for the concepts being addressed. And that's all part of comprehensible input. And also thinking about how welcome are your students' home languages in the classroom? Is there something, do you have routines in place that allows students to tap into their home languages? Are things labeled in in the students' home languages? So maybe there's a whole, maybe it's defined, and having students in all the different languages talk about what that word define is and have a visual for that they can draw on. And so can they draw on their whole linguistic repertoire? And again, when we're talking about these cognitive spaces, what are students expected to do with language? We're thinking about academic language functions. So, and that's the purpose of language. Are students expected to describe or explain or persuade? What are they expected to do? And if we think about a building, remember I was talking about communicative competency at the beginning, bricks, mortar, and buildings. And if we think about those buildings have different purposes, right? I have a house. My house is built one way because it meets the needs of the purpose of, so I have a place to sleep. I have a kitchen to prepare food. But a gas station has a different construction because it has a different function. So, so we're thinking about that. And then, so they have different structures depending on the different purpose. Yeah, go ahead. Real quick question.
Hi there, Stephanie. I'm just wondering, so in my school, I'm the learning support facilitator, and I'm going to be needing to introduce this to staff. So if I were a fourth grade teacher, what would I be needing to tell them to do when I look at the tracking sheet part A and the tracking sheet part B? I'm thinking those are things that teacher is going to need to do. Am I on the right track?
Yeah. So like, what are looking at looking at the language that students are producing and how that fits into the benchmarks. And then, and then using that as a baseline, as a tool to look at, okay, now I know that they're at a level 1. So, so right now they're working in all of those kind of key competency areas of a level 1. What can I do to support them in their listening, reading, speaking, and writing so that they're in level 1, but also what can I do to help them grow into level 2, level 3? I don't know. Does that kind of answer your question?
Absolutely. I
Okay.
do wonder, with regards to your slide number 21, benchmark indicators, how does that, so we're still needing to determine their levels in listening, speaking, reading, writing.
Mhm.
And then are we using the benchmark indicators information there to
Yeah.
connect the?
Yeah. So you would be looking at your benchmark indicators in vocabulary, sentence structure, and connections and transitions, and that would kind of give you an idea of where they're at. And I guess, are you asking? So I'm looking at listening and vocabulary, speaking, reading, writing, and each one of those, are you wondering like how to kind of, if they're at a vocabulary and listening and they're a level 1 and their sentence structure in listening level B, and connections and transitions, they're at an A? Is that kind of what you're, and like how to put that 1, 2, 3, or 4 or whatever?
Right. You know, I'm wondering, and like I certainly, it doesn't need to be, would you be able to help us maybe go through how would we fill out one of the tracking sheets?
Yeah. So today or
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know if anybody else wants to hear that.
Sure.
They don't have to, but I think yeah, to actually to show us what the expectation is.
Okay.
Not to go through, we don't have to go through, you know, the whole thing, but just to give us a start. And like what I do remember, I think you had said something about on tracking sheet part A, for example, we would not necessarily use the terms beginner, intermediate, advanced. We would be using A, B, but can you just maybe clarify, just so we've got, I'd love to have something, visual to show teachers. Thank you.
Yeah. No, and the response from the crowd, happy to help. So so you're looking at this sheet, right? Is that what you're kind of thinking of? And
Correct.
how to support teachers in filling this out. Okay.
That's right. That and part B as well.
Right. Okay. So the part A is kind of the summary sheet of part B. So you would take a look, and this would be your tracking sheet, and you would kind of compile and look at where they are in listening, speaking, reading, and writing for each of these for each of these key competency indicators, and where they may be in the level. And again, that's the lovely thing about this document as well, is that if you're in grade 1, you only have to look up through level 2. So you only have to look through vocabulary, sentence structure, and connections and transitions up to level 2. So sorry, grade 12, 10, 12, you're going to have to look through all 6, but then you can also kind of get a sense from, just discussions with students about, where's a starting point where you may want to look for. Like if they're looking at you with a blank stare, then, maybe that might be an indicator that they may be more to the beginner stage. But if they're giving you full answers, they'll probably be more towards the intermediate stage. And then, so looking at the listening, speaking, reading, and writing pieces where they may be. So say a student, you've got a grade, we've got a grade 7 to 9 student. Okay. So you see a grade 7 to 9 student, you're noticing that their vocabulary in listening, they're able to discern, they're understanding words that our basic descriptive words, their instructional words, their expressions and social greetings. They're understanding that, they're responding to it. So, and they know what to do with it. If they've read it, they know how to interact with it. So they may have achieved this level 1 in listening, but they're not using the speaking. Actually, sorry, I'm going to go back. So they've achieved level 1 in listening. Okay. But sentence structure, you're giving sentences that they have some familiar phrases, some substitution of words in simple pattern sentences. So yeah, I haven't seen so much that they're simple pattern sentences, but when they definitely know some memorized phrases. So they've achieved listening in level B. But then for connections and transitions, I should write down what I'm writing here. So, so vocabulary, they've achieved level 1. Sentence structure, they've achieved level B. And connections and transitions, they're understanding, they're able to connect some ideas and locate some items. They're understanding that. So, following those directions, they're able to understand that. So maybe they've reached a level 1 they've achieved a level 1 in vocabulary and connections and transitions, but they haven't achieved sentence structure in listening yet. So they're still just, those simple pattern sentences. When they're listening to them, they still just aren't responding to them. Okay. So they're at a 1 here in vocabulary, a B here in sentence structure, and a 1 here in connections and transition, right? So they haven't completed level 1 for all of those. So when you're looking at this tracking sheet, they're still working in level 1 for listening. So you would, on this tracking sheet, say they're in year 2, in your first report, that they would still be working in level 1. And you can add notes in here and say where their strengths and where their grows are, their glows and their grows. So vocabulary, achieve level 1, or sentence structure, achieve level B, and connections and transitions, they've achieved level 1. So there's still need to grow a little bit in listening in level B, in level 1. Does that kind of make sense? Does that make sense?
Stephanie, I do have a question. What if you've got a student that is at 3 different levels, right? With their vocabulary, they're at 1, sentence, they're at B, connections, I'm making this up.
Yeah,
they're at
exactly.
3, right?
Yeah.
What would you put for their on tracking sheet part A? What would you put for their listening?
So I would tend to, that's a good question. Vocabulary, if they're lower on vocabulary, I would tend to use the vocabulary area. And so if they're lower on vocabulary, say they're at a B in vocabulary, I would say that that's kind of how I would base my assessment, would be that they would be working in listening at a level B, but also making note of where their glows and their grows are, right? So because vocabulary is substantial for understanding the content, making themselves understood, all of those pieces, it's kind of it's the bricks in the mortar, right? So understanding those pieces. I don't know. Does that help answer your question?
It sounds like it's professional judgment.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say that. I would say that. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a much better answer. Instead of saying, Stephanie said. So yeah, use your professional judgment. So,
And then the same for the overall
mhm,
on tracking
Yeah.
sheet part A. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so
yeah,
much.
I hope that helps a little bit. So great. Do you use 4 separate tests to assess these strands, or combine listening and speaking, or reading and speaking? I would strongly recommend combining the listening and speaking together, because they kind of go hand in hand. You're asking them a question, they're responding to the question. Reading and speaking, yeah, or reading and writing, they're reading something and then they can provide a written response to it. So yeah, I would tend to put those together instead of in isolation. All right. I'm not sure if I'm going to get through everything here, but all the goodies that I have in store for you. But I will just address the fact of, you know, because we got 5 minutes left. I would address the fact of looking at developing language objectives, and thinking about language objectives offer information or can help you guide your like, how are you going to get students to show what they know. So the next couple of slides here just indicate some of that in developing language objectives, and just because it gives you a tool. What I like about language objectives, and I'm really glad about all these questions in here, and I think those are valuable questions in terms of benchmarking. But I'm going to just pop this idea of language objectives into your heads here, because when they're used in conjunction with the benchmarks, they give that easy and ongoing assessment measure to monitor that language development. Because language objectives, they are, I'll just, here. They just give you an idea of what you want students to know, but then the language objectives give students the idea of how are they going to show that they know. So thinking about, your outcomes, what's the content, what's the vocabulary, what's the format of the lesson, what's the cognitive space of the language that they're going to be using, are they describing, are they comparing, whatever it may be, and what's the language that they need to do for that. And yeah, so those are just some pieces. And I've also put in a tool for scaffolding that language, just a planning checklist. It's hyperlinked in here if you want to access it. It's from Support Ed, and just some things to look for when you're planning your for language. And also, I'll put it in the chat here. There is a new updated version of the ERLC had a supporting English language learners website. What I did over the summer was I updated it and gave a refresh, renamed it to the EAL Toolkit. I'm still figuring out how to get it in the search engine, that when you Google search the EAL Toolkit, that you'll find it, but you have the link here. If you Google the old site supporting English language learners, you'll also have it. But it's a great tool. If you want to find some more information about planning for language development, there's a tab and a page for that as well. Yeah, and last but not least is hopefully we've addressed some of these ideas, how they're similar to and different from the old version, and using it for programming. Again, if you have some time to use that survey link that you were provided, I'd really like to hear your feedback on this and see how I can improve. And also, who are you going to call in terms of, you know, that funding compliance, please reach out to Alberta Education. There's the link there, additional-languages at gov.ab.ca. And if you have some questions for professional learning or some consulting, work with your staff, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to offer any information that I can. And yeah, I did set it so that you can't, I will change the settings in this presentation. So you'll make it so that you will be able to make a copy of it. Let me do that right now. And we'll go from there. And Krista, you had a question?
Hi, Stephanie, thank you so much for all the information today. My
welcome.
question is, are we expected to be using the benchmarks 2.0 this year?
Okay, great question.
Going to use 1.0. Thank you.
So they've been approved for use for the 23-24 school year, and they're recommended, but they're optional. So, you know, school authorities, they have the flexibility to make local policy decisions about the materials used for programming and for assessment for our EAL learners, based on your resources, needs of students, needs of the school community. So you have the option of implementing them this year, next year, or, you know, working with Alberta Education to see how you want to incorporate any assessment for our students. Does that help answer your question?
It does. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're very welcome. So you should be able to print that off now. And any other questions?
Would
Yeah.
you be able to share the link one more time to it? Because I couldn't scroll back far enough in the chat to find the link again. Thank you so much.
Yes, I was going to do that and then I forgot. Thank you for the reminder. So we'll do that and we'll put that in the chat and make sure everybody. All right, awesome. Yeah. Oh, printing out the new EAL benchmarks. Yeah, you need to, print the, isn't that Summer's landscape? Yeah. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what your print settings may be to set that up so that nothing's cut off. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. Sorry. Yeah, please.
Sorry, my question was just if you could share that again, and you already did. I will put my hand down. Thank you so much.
Okay. Awesome. Great. Yeah. A minute, 2 minutes over. There any other questions that I can help answer or? Is the benchmark both parts A and B, or is B the benchmark and A is helpful for instruction? I would kind of keep them together, you know, in your student records, you know, both the A and the B, because, you know, you can definitely annotate on that B side, and kind of, you know, see where you have indicators. And then also just looking at, yeah, and making notes. So I'd keep them together, just for better reference. In terms of the question of, sorry, do we need to evaluate all 4 strands or a minimum of 1? So the assessment requirements using benchmarks 2.0, it includes the assessment of all 3 key competencies in 1 or more strands. It's recommended that they all 3 competencies be assessed in all 4 strands, and I'll leave it with the word recommended. So because the more comprehensive you have information that you gather on listening, their listening, speaking, reading, writing skills, the greater your programming will be affected by. So like, it'll be just, you can tailor it a little bit better. So if you're just assessing one strand, it's not really looking at, so if you're just assessing speaking, it's not really addressing what they're doing for reading, writing, or listening, because and then when you're supporting teachers and their growth of the learner in those competency areas, then it can be hard to say, okay, where they're at. So so it's recommended. That's all. Any other questions here? I have a suggested assessment for initial placement or intake. Would IPT, Woodcock Minot's teacher judgment with the benchmark? Yeah. So when we think about the benchmarks, they are kind of a working document. I understand, like, especially when you get into secondary, we want to make sure that we have a good assessment measure of students, so that we can find proper placement and proper supports for them. There's pros and cons to the IPT, the Woodcock Minot's. There are definitely divisions across the province who use those measures. There's and they definitely, IPT definitely is great for doing that initial assessment for large numbers of students. One thing I'm not sure of is how the IPTs align with the new benchmarks. So, you'll get results from the IPT, but how do they fit into the benchmarks as well? So, the other thing about the IPT, especially the writing part, this is my personal point of view, so just something to think about. Sometimes the writing prompts there are something that students may relate to, so it could be difficult to get an authentic piece of what they're writing is all about. So I did give some suggestions in the EAL toolkit. So through that initial assessment piece, so you can take a look under initial language proficiency assessment, and there's kind of a process in there. But then again, I do understand that the assessment piece does take quite a bit of time, and how you're going to, manage it with teacher workload, things like that. But in terms of, the other piece is looking at reading and writing in their first language, and then having kind of an informal interview with them, and also, oral response, and then this writing in English. So, thinking about if they're able to write in their home language, they should be able to give them an opportunity to try to write in English. And, here's a couple of more authentic prompts that you may want to consider, like writing a letter to a friend in your own country, and telling your friend about the first days in your new country, writing a letter to introduce yourself for new teachers, describing your favorite teachers from your last school. So something that they can kind of connect to. I know in the IPT, there's some social justice pieces in there, and there's some cultural pieces in there that, depending where the student is from, that may not relate to them. Like, it's like giving, I can't remember what it was, but that's something that I'm just thinking of. So this is just a framework, and some ideas that were the steps that were outlined by Elizabeth Coelho in her book, Adding English. And I just want to reiterate that they're just to provide some a suggested procedure for conducting initial assessment, but how you do initial assessment is at the district's discretion. So, you know, just thinking about those pieces. So, you know, the more authentic work you have from students, the better. Any other questions? You know, I appreciate everybody hanging on for a couple extra minutes to think about this, but you're very welcome. Will there be extra sessions? Well, I'm doing another one. It's just a repeat this afternoon from 1 till 3. I'll be doing another one from tomorrow from 3:45 to 5:45. And I will be repeating them again in late January, early February again. So you're very welcome. Thanks for coming out. All right, I'll stop the recording here.